So I want to start by providing a little bit of context for what is motivated me to put together this particular session here, and then provide a little bit of an outline of what we're going to be looking at with our time together this evening here. So this is thinking about one aspect of kind of professional communication here, and thinking about how to really clarify different pieces of your own background, of your own experience, and then particular goals, especially in the context of academic work, of scholarship, and then the kind of work that's done for anyone who's interested in pursuing an academic career as a researcher, as a professor here. But this is really something that comes together in a lot of different types of opportunities here, whether you might be applying for a fellowship opportunity, for an academic job, for another type of grant or postdoctoral position there, really for any job, but those types in particular here. But at the core of those applications, you're going to be making a larger argument that on some level is going to be about who you are and why your work matters. And so that can look like a lot of different things that can be directed in a number of different ways. You may be asked to speak to these issues through a variety of different documents or in a range of different settings here. But really, the goal here is to get us thinking a little bit about some of these big picture components here and how to go about thinking through some of the self-reflection that's necessary to be able to adequately address these in a variety of different settings here. And so my goal for this particular session is to help you generate some ideas that can then be used for a variety of different sort of contexts. It could be used for a cover letter, particularly for an academic job. It could be used as part of a personal statement for a fellowship, or grant that might require some type of document there. It could just be some useful language and self-reflection and ideas and categories that you might be able to then draw upon in the context of an interview or context of a presentation, as well. And so the goal is not just to prepare you to write a particular type of document. This is not geared at any one specific, um, you know, job document or fellowship or some sort of opportunity like that. It's really about giving you some material that you can then build upon and use in a variety of different settings here, as part of your graduate student career and professional development here, so that you can then be able to articulate what your own personal narrative is as a researcher and as a scholar in particular as well. So this is going to be a little bit of reflection, and it will give you a chance to hopefully be able to approach those sort of things. And so whatever you may be asked to produce that might relate to some of these things where you're thinking about how to align research interests, professional goals, and values, this is really a chance for you to begin thinking through that process, and hopefully it will continue beyond just the time that we have together this evening. And so, as I said, we're going to do a little bit of guided reflection. I'll talk through a few points here. Then I'll share some questions. I have a worksheet that I will make available a little bit later. I'll give you a few minutes to do a little bit of thinking at different points in our session here. But really, again, I think this is something that you can return to later on if you find this to be useful. And really, this is meant to help stimulate a little bit of self-reflection, maybe some things you thought about before, maybe some new ideas, and hopefully you'll come away with this with some language and maybe some concepts that may be useful for a variety of things going forward here. So we'll do a little bit of reflection on research significance. We'll think a little bit about personal journey. Then we'll introduce this idea of scholarly identity, this concept of scholarly identity mapping, that I think is one useful way to see how these things fit together. But I want to start with this idea of scholarly identity at the beginning, and just describe in a broad sense how this is often understood, and then we're going to take it in a related direction, but we're going to kind of expand this a little bit here as well. So this is from an article from several years ago about establishing your scholarly identity that Inside Higher Ed published, that really emphasizes this idea that scholarly identity is sort of your brand as a researcher. You know, what are the types of projects that you are interested in doing? What are the areas of expertise that you have, the types of questions, themes, technical skills there, and really sort of your larger reputation in your field. As current or prospective graduate students, as scholars in training, this is something that you're in the early stages of developing here. So the point is not that you have this fully fleshed out or that you should already have a clear sense of what this is. This is more just recognizing that this is something, if you choose to continue in a research career, if you choose to pursue an academic career, that you're going to want to be developing. You want to have that kind of professional reputation, that scholarly reputation in your particular field. that sort of signals the type of researcher, scientist, scholar, academic that you are, the type of work that you are doing, and the focus and approach that you take for that as well. Um, so that's really, in the simplest sense, what scholarly identity um, can be about. But really, it's also something that can be even more expansive than just this sort of particular focus on specific research interests and specific skills here. We're going to think about this in a little bit more expansive a way to include thinking about how you bring together some of the motivations for why you're doing the things that you're doing and how those align with the type of activities that you're pursuing here as well. So I think this is a great starting point, and I think this is a useful concept to think about here. But I don't want to just limit us to these things here because I think there are other reasons, there are other things that may be important to reflect on that can help you communicate really what your particular distinct approach and story is, because there are opportunities where you may be called upon to speak to those kind of things. And these are just some examples of this as well. So for both fellowship opportunities, if you're looking for funding, both as a graduate student or, beyond as a professional applying for grants or for postdoctoral opportunities, and for, again, thinking about academic jobs in particular here, there is an increasing emphasis on understanding how you as an individual are making an impact through your research, through your work here. The National Science Foundation has used this category of broader impacts for many years. How does your work impact certain areas that they see as desirable in terms of the larger social benefits of science and research there? There's also this concept that some people talk about called socially responsible science, thinking about how scientists, how researchers can pursue the work that they're doing in ways that are beneficial to society, that are being used for public good here. And really, the public value of research and education is something that institutions are really interested in right now. There's definitely a lot of discussion in society about the value of higher education. Frankly, there's a lot of suspicion in some places about what universities are doing, what scholars and researchers are doing, and so a lot of institutions, a lot of disciplines are really thinking about how do we convey the value of what we do, the larger impact of what we're doing here as well. This is also related to questions about how to make scholarship and society a more equitable place. So discussions around belonging, inclusion, diversity, equity, lots of different terminology is used, but around those kind of issues here as well. And so in some academic jobs, you might be expected to provide a statement around those sort of things about your experience, goals for those sort of things here as well. And so in addition to having a sense of what it is that you want to research, and the type of questions that you want to approach from a scholarly standpoint, for a variety of different reasons, you may be called upon to speak to the larger public impact of what it is that you're doing here. And so in the face of that challenge, that opportunity here, the goal is really to be able to think about how your research relates to your larger professional identity, to the activities that you're pursuing, and the sort of underlying goals that motivate it here as well. Again, this might be something that comes into a research statement, a personal statement, or a cover letter, depending on the opportunity there. Or for if you're applying for a position that might have a diversity statement or a teaching statement where some of these questions about values and your intent in your approach to working with others comes into play. That's part of what we're thinking about here as well. And this relates to this useful concept of creating a coherent public profile, which is really just giving a sense of who you are holistically as a scholar, so that if somebody is familiar with your work, they're familiar with what your public presence is. Some scholars are really active on social media or writing in certain forums, or have been involved in certain initiatives or professional opportunities or civically engaged there. And the idea here is if you're thinking about pursuing opportunities, if you're thinking about applying for different jobs and things like that, creating some sense of continuity to sort of see those points of connection, or at least conveying how you see how things fit together, not that there's one specific way that needs to be done, can be an important thing for thinking about how your scholarship relates to these other topics. But before you can do that, before you can really address that effectively, in an interview or in some particular written materials that you may be called upon to produce for jobs or fellowships and the like there, you need to be able to articulate that story, to have some sense about what it is that you're doing here. And this is really about telling a cohesive story that relates to how you make a larger impact there. I'm borrowing NSF's language of broader impacts. Other disciplines, other organizations use different terminology here, but I think that's hopefully an intelligible way to think about what these sort of things mean here. And so we'll do some guided reflection on some questions. And again, my hope is that by reflecting on some of these questions and coming up with some short answers for yourself, you can then draw upon these big picture ideas, these high level statements to then inform more specific answers that you may be called upon to write depending on what the opportunity is here. So I think clarifying some language, giving some concepts and ideas can be really useful because sometimes you get a prompt or you realize I need to submit this particular document, or you get asked a question in a presentation or in an interview. And if you haven't thought about it before, it can be really challenging to sort of articulate in a coherent or effective way your thoughts on some of these sort of things here there. So a little bit of reflection will hopefully serve you well, and then you can repurpose this and then build on this and adapt and tailor it to a variety of different types of contexts. So this is how these things are going to fit together in the context of this presentation here. So we're going to do a little bit of reflection on research, thinking about intellectual interests and significance. What are the things that you are curious about from an academic or scholarly standpoint, why that matters in terms of its intellectual contribution to your discipline there. We'll think a little bit about your personal journey, the values and the motivations that have led you to pursue the type of training and the type of work and the type of projects that you're interested in doing, and the larger impact of that activity here. And those two pieces are going to come together in this idea of scholarly identity, how that personal journey, how that research relates there. And so we'll reflect a little bit on some language around how to best name and describe that scholarly identity. And then we'll use that reflection there to reflect a little bit on this idea of a mission statement, a personal vision of your values, of your professional activity, and how it relates to this larger impact you want to make. This idea that I'm going to call public engagement, and I'll bring in some other resources that I hope you'll find useful for some of this as well. So we'll look at each of these points in turn, and they build and relate to each other. And at the end of it, hopefully it will be something that will be useful to think about going forward here. So let's start. Let's think a little bit about research. Let's think about how the things that you're doing might make a contribution to your discipline, how they might have implications beyond your field, and how they might relate to other types of professional activities here. Things, if we're thinking about academic careers, like teaching, like mentoring students, other researchers there, and professional or university service here as part of it as well. And so I've got a couple questions, and I'm going to put a document in the chat here that will contain the questions that we'll be looking at tonight here. I just want you to take a couple minutes to do a little bit of reflection here. We're not going to spend a ton of time on this, but I think it will be useful to, if you haven't had a chance to try to think through some of these things before, hopefully this will give you a chance to think through a couple points that are going to be useful for this. So I'll go ahead and I'm going to put this PDF document in the chat here. And it will contain some additional prompts that we'll get to a little bit later. So these first questions are on that document here, but take a couple minutes, think about some of these things in relationship to the type of research that you are doing, thinking about who might be interested in it, and then thinking a little bit about the why behind it. What motivates you intellectually about these sort of things here. So I'll give you a couple minutes to think through this, and then we'll draw on some of those ideas as we go forward and look at those other parts that I outlined just a minute ago. So this is just a starting point. And again, if you haven't had a chance to think about these things, or if you don't feel like, oh, I've got a great, compelling answer off the top of your head, that's totally fine. Again, the point of all this here is not to say you should already have clear ideas on these points here. These are more things that are always useful to be thinking about in the back of your head. And I don't know where everybody's at in terms of the type of program you might be in or the stage that you're at within it there. So, if you're relatively new in a graduate degree program, you may still be trying to figure out a research direction. Others of you might be getting close to applying for whatever comes next professionally. And so, this is more just the important thing to keep in mind that you should be reflecting on some of these things and know sort of how you're positioning yourself within your particular field. What's unique, distinct, what's the contribution of what you're doing, and then who it's going to matter to. That's important for identifying research collaborators, for thinking about where you might be able to find funding if you're looking for grants and other awards there, and for being able to articulate the impact of the work that you're doing for institutions, for your profession, and for your own career here as well. So again, if you haven't thought through these or you're just kind of wondering, just be curious about this. Be thinking about this periodically as you're pursuing your studies, your research, and as you're looking at opportunities for professional and career development here as part of this. So since we're online and I don't want to take too much time here, we're not going to have like a big discussion about your particular responses here as well. But again, keep these ideas percolating because I think these are always useful questions to be asking regardless of what stage that you're at. Because these are easy questions to pose, but they can be difficult ones to answer. And they're really going to depend on the context in some cases in terms of what you're looking for as well. And so just thinking about this in a multifaceted way can be really helpful because what's distinctive about your research can be many different things. It could be the methods you're employing, it could be the applications of that particular work, it could be the particular study system or populations or location where you're pursuing work there. And all of those things could be relevant to different audiences there. And so just being aware of that is always going to be a helpful thing to be thinking about. So that's one thing, just thinking a little bit about research significance, why what you're doing matters from a scholarly standpoint. What's its intellectual contribution? How is it advancing a particular field? And what it is that you're hoping to do with it. Those are important questions here. The next thing that I want us to think about is your personal journey here. Because whether or not you have to write a personal statement, which is a requirement for some graduate fellowships or postdoctoral awards, and even some faculty fellowships here as well, this is also something that's going to inform other documents here, an academic cover letter, a teaching statement, a diversity statement, a research statement in some cases, depending on the field here as well. And when you're thinking about applying for those kind of opportunities, you really need to make sure that everything that you are submitting is really telling a cohesive story about your larger professional trajectory, about your training, about your goals, your preparation, your interests, again, your values. And this is really the narrative that ties together all those different things. The through line that will help somebody see, okay, yes, this is a coherent, a holistic approach. This is a whole person who has kind of a coherent story to tell that goes through their CV, that goes through the research that they've published or that they're working on, that goes through their cover letter and some of those other things here as well. And we're focusing here on your personal journey in the context of being a scholar or a professional. This is not an exhaustive autobiography. This is not, a detailed unpacking of every significant event that's happened in your life here. This is thinking about what are the things that have shaped you as a scholar or professional in your particular field and that are kind of indicating the direction that you want to move forward in here as well. In some cases, those may be personal experiences, things that have happened in your life, things about your background or identity. In other cases, these may be more academic or, focused on your discipline in particular here. The point is not that it should be one or the other. The point is, what is the case for you? What are the experiences that have been most instrumental in leading you to the discipline that you're in and to the types of projects that you're pursuing within it here? What are some of the things that you've accomplished along the way that have prepared you for whatever that next step that you're hoping to take is? And again, what are the things that have motivated you along that way? Questions, issues, values, problems, and your larger plans and goals here as part of that. And so that's what I mean when I'm talking about your personal journey here. So this is not meant to be prying into anybody's private life or to try to really get you to talk about something you don't want to. That's definitely never something you should feel pressured to do, in any setting. Here it's thinking though about how can you make sense of the journey that you've been on as somebody in a graduate program and as somebody preparing for some kind of career that will make use of that training going forward. And so you have some additional questions on that handout that I gave you here. And I'll give you a couple minutes to think through some of these things as well here. Think about some of those turning points, those key experiences that have really been influential, again, in bringing you to where you are right now from a professional and from a scholarly standpoint, and where you see that leading into the future. What are the main things you've taken away? Key experiences that maybe have prepared you for something or given you a particular interest. And then thinking about some of the values that may have led you to this as well. How are you involved outside of just your research? There's maybe something directly related to scholarship or your discipline, and maybe in other sort of things here as well. But those are the sort of things that can speak to the values that motivate you, that may play a factor in some of the things that you're doing in a more academic context here. So again, the goal is just to generate some ideas, think through a few things, jot down a few notes if that's helpful here, reflect for a few minutes on some of these kind of questions about the key turning points that have led you on the scholarly journey that all of you are on here. Okay, hopefully you were able to come up with a few ideas, few experiences that maybe came to mind. As I said with the research questions that we looked at a couple minutes ago as well, the point is not that you have fully fleshed out answers to all of these here, but hopefully you can think of a couple things. And if you haven't had a chance to, I would encourage you to take a little bit more time after this. Again, as I said before, this is just a chance to really hopefully stimulate some thoughts that you can then return to as you think about that later on, because that can be a really useful way to structure this sort of larger narrative. If you think about several key moments, I have some additional materials and resources that I'm happy to share with anybody who's interested in thinking through some of these things in a little bit more detail here. But for now, I'm hoping that you were able to come up with at least a couple of ideas. And if you weren't, that you can kind of make a mental note of that and think, okay, maybe I should spend a little bit more time thinking about that. I wish I did have more of an answer to that. So that's something that I can just be aware of as I'm going about my day, or as I'm taking some time to reflect on some of the things that I'm doing right here. So we've looked at a couple different pieces, thought about a couple questions related to research and interest and sort of the intellectual impact of the things that we're doing, thought a little bit about that personal journey and some questions that will hopefully kind of clarify how we link together some of those decisions and transformative experiences and motivations here. The next step is to try to bring those two pieces together here. between the sort of things that might go into a research statement and might go into a personal statement here. And this is where we're coming to that idea of scholarly identity and using it in a slightly expansive way, more expansive way than the way that I introduced it at the very beginning here. And so we're going to think about this idea of scholarly identity as how you make an impact in your discipline and your larger community. And I'll use community just as a general term for some sort of audience outside of just your scholarly and professional context here. That can mean a lot of different things. I'm not necessarily talking about the neighborhood you live in or the city or something there. People are part of a lot of different circles and contexts and organizations and things like that. So I'm going to use that in an expansive way to sort of signal those sort of things there here. And so you can think about who you would consider to be part of that. And that's something also that may vary depending on the specific context where you may be reflecting on these questions here. But this scholarly identity, this way that you're putting together these different pieces, is really going to be helpful for articulating, again, that coherent vision of who you are. And again, this is something that is increasingly a common feature of fellowship applications, as I talked about some of those concepts earlier about socially responsible science or broader impacts. And so having some thought about these sort of things, I think, is going to be useful in a variety of contexts, even if you don't end up having to write a specific document that's called like a diversity statement or something like that, because people are interested in thinking about some of the questions and ideas that have informed those types of prompts and things there. And so we're going to do a little bit of reflection using what I think is a really useful tool from a scholar, anthropologist by training, who is also someone who's put together a lot of great educational resources, Mary Price. She put together something called scholarly identity mapping. This is really something that was directed for faculty, for helping faculty as they're preparing for tenure to think about their activities and things here. But I think that there's a lot of it that is applicable to scholars really at any stage, including graduate students here. And so this is really trying to think about how are your values connecting the different aspects of academic work, like research, like teaching and mentoring, like service. What are the larger commitments and the public impact of your scholarly activity here? And I have a link, and I'll share these materials with all of you in a follow-up tomorrow so that you can look at this in more detail. I'm drawing on some aspects of this here, but you can find the full explanation in the link there, along with some additional readings and worksheets and activities and things. If you find this to be useful, I would definitely encourage you to explore that in greater depth here. But I think that even just in the abbreviated form that we're going to look at it tonight, hopefully you'll find this to be a stimulating way to think through some of these things about how we're connecting values with activities. These are not questions that I'm going to ask you to think about on the worksheet here right now, but these are sort of the questions that inform this process of scholarly identity mapping, and that we're going to get at through a couple of different exercises here in a moment there. So just thinking about who you are as a scholar, a practitioner, a professional, however you might just define that in relationship to the career you're interested in pursuing, to the discipline that you might be part of. What are the public purposes of your work here? In some disciplines and some fields that might be very obvious. Maybe you're doing public policy or public health or social work or something where, there's kind of a clear, larger social mission to that. And other disciplines, that may not be as immediate of an answer that just sort of jumps to mind about that. That's fine as well. I think any scholarship, any discipline has larger impact and larger meaning, and it doesn't need to look the exact same way. But it's important to think about what that means to you here. And then what are the values, again, that motivate you, and how are those values expressed in the work that you're doing? What are the ends that you're pursuing? What are the outcomes that you're hoping will result from the research that you're doing, from the activities that you're part of? And all of this will come together and really helping to articulate what makes you distinct, because everyone has their own particular approach. We all have our own backgrounds, our own stories, our own motivations and values and things. Even if you're in the same program, even if you may be working in a lab with other people who are doing similar research there. And so don't worry, everybody does have something distinct to offer, and really this is just a way to get you thinking through some of this. So we'll take a look at a couple things that will hopefully help develop some answers to these underlying questions that really motivate this exercise here. So we're going to start with this idea of scholarly values. What are the things that you value in the context of your academic work as a researcher, as an expert in your particular discipline? So think about this in terms of teaching, research, or creative activity, if anybody's in an arts field here, or service. These are just some these are just some examples that I've drawn from Mary Price. This is not an exhaustive list, so please feel free to come up with other ones or to add, additional options here if a word comes to mind that you haven't thought about, or rather that you don't see here. But I would encourage you to try to think about three or four that you really think about are integral to who you are as a scholar who is doing work that has some sort of impact on the larger world here. And the caveat that I always give when I do this here as well is that in choosing three or four, that doesn't mean that you're saying you think that other ones don't matter. No, I think we can make a case for the value of every item on this, and I'm sure other items that could be listed here as well. So, just because you chose discipline, rigor, and respect, and somebody else picked, equity, safety, and humility, doesn't mean that one is the right answer, one is the wrong answer, or that you don't value those other things because you focus on the ones there. But think about which are the ones that are really the most important to you with the way that you approach the type of research that you are pursuing here. So I'll give you a couple minutes to reflect on that, and I'm hoping that a few of these are going to stand out to you. But if not, think of other adjectives that you would apply to your academic work, to research, to, again, related things like teaching and mentoring. And this will be the basis for that next stage in thinking about what your scholarly identity is. All right, I'm hoping that a few of these as well. Another question that I have listed in there that I haven't really unpacked as well that can be useful for additional reflection is what makes these values scholarly, as opposed to, just things that might be um, qualities that you value in the world or you think are important in interpersonal relations as well. I did this session with a group on campus about a year ago, and we had a really interesting discussion about that. About what makes a particular value a scholarly value as opposed to something that you might value in other sort of contexts there. And again, I don't think that there's one uniform answer for what that looks like here, but I would encourage you to think about what that means. You may value some of these things in other contexts, or you might think, this is really important to my teaching, but when it comes to my scholarship, when it comes to the research I'm doing, the experiments I'm running, the field work, whatever that might look like, these are the things that are important too. And the goal with all of this is to help you have a better understanding of what it is that you think so that you can articulate it here. I've said this before, I'm going to keep emphasizing this. The point is not that there's one right answer. The point is not that you should definitely value these things more and you should definitely say that that's the case because that's what somebody ostensibly wants to hear you say. No, the point is that there are lots of things that are important and we all have, slightly different levels of interest and slightly different passions and points of emphasis. And the point is that you should be able to identify that so that you can emphasize that and then be able to point to evidence of that in the activities that you're doing here. So hopefully you've got a few words, some things that stood out here that we are using to further build and reflect on these larger points here, let's take this a step further. Let's think about how we might combine some of those values in terms of a descriptor of how you might describe yourself as an academic professional. So we're not exactly using the exact same words that we found before in that previous slide here, but think about how they might relate to how you might choose to describe yourself. So we're thinking about here, what is the noun that you might choose? Do you think of yourself as a scholar or a scientist or an educator? And then what are the adjectives that you would want to sort of fix before that there as well? Do you think of yourself as a scholar activist or a community engaged clinician, or justice oriented administrator? Think about what are the adjectives and then what are the nouns that best connect to you. And again, no right or wrong answers here. It's really what are the things that you feel like establish that, because this is getting us hopefully giving you a better sense of how you'd want to emphasize what it is that you are doing through your scholarship and how you connect that with the types of activities that you engage in and the work that you do here. So again, I'll give you a minute or two to think about this. And of course, don't just limit yourself to these. These are just meant to get you started thinking here. So if there are other adjectives that come to mind or that you feel like are a better descriptor there or other nouns there, definitely think about those sort of things here as well. But hopefully, if you're not entirely sure, these will at least be some examples that will hopefully get you started with this brainstorming here. All right, hopefully you have come up with some language here that sort of connects here. And again, ideally, these are terms that would somehow also relate to those scholarly values that you identified, those 3 to 4 terms that we picked out from the previous slide here. Again, we're thinking about how do those particular values then relate to a way you might describe yourself as a professional here to try to build that sense of continuity. And of course, how do those values relate to that personal journey that you've had and to the type of research that you're doing here as well. So let's take this a step further. One of the things that I've suggested along the way here is that some of these things might be different depending on a particular context. The values that motivate your teaching may or may not be the same ones that motivate your research or your mentoring or your involvement with your department, with your program, with a professional organization, with the community here. And so I think it's important to recognize that we have different roles, personal and professional, and they relate to each other in different ways here. And so I think it's useful to spend a little time and think about how do you see those parts fitting together? And here I've outlined some of the key features of academic work for anybody interested in a faculty career: research, teaching, mentoring, advising, service, community involvement. Think about how those pieces relate to each other here. And again, there's no right answer. The correct answer is not that each part is equally informing the other parts there, but it may be the case that, the teaching that you want to do is going to be closely related to your research, or maybe you see that as separate. Maybe the research is one thing, but you really see teaching and mentoring as being things that are related together, or maybe with advising as part of that as well. Maybe the work that you do outside of your professional capacity in the community. Maybe that's really important, and maybe you see that as related to your research. Maybe that's just something entirely separate. Again, that's not right or wrong. That's just you understanding how you think about these things here, because that will help you to then be able to better articulate how you see those relationships. So I can't stress this enough. The point is not that you should think about these in a certain way. It's just that you become aware of how you're doing that so that you can be more intentional, hopefully, in your approach to these things, and also so that you can be clearer in how you explain these sort of things. If somebody explains, what's your teaching philosophy? How does it relate to these other things that you're not caught completely off guard and having never thought of these sort of things before? So this is something to think about. How are things integrated? Do you see sort of research as being like the big category and the other things are inside of it? Do you see these as relatively separate? Are some pieces connected here? Think about your own diagrams as well, if these are not necessarily capturing what you think is going on here. But I do think that thinking about how these pieces relate or don't relate is always going to be helpful, because once you have a sense of that, it will be easier for you to be able to explain that, hopefully in a way that is clear and compelling to whoever it is that you're interacting with here. All right. So we've thought a little bit about these ideas of scholarly identity, about the different dimensions of it, about some of the descriptors we might use in terms of our values and in terms of how we might describe ourselves as academic professionals here. Now that we've thought a little bit about these things, that next step to make this compelling, to make it, so substantive to others as you're trying to communicate this, is to be able to provide evidence for this. And that means showing how those values, those motivations, those relationships that you've spent a little bit of time reflecting on are connected to particular actions here. It's one thing to say, that you are a student-centered teacher. It's another thing to actually have evidence that speaks to that. And so you want to make sure that the values that you're claiming and the descriptions that you think are accurate for how you want to approach things there, that you can point to things that you've done that really would emphasize that, so somebody can come away convinced that, yes, this is definitely your particular approach here. So how you demonstrate these values in your research or your teaching or mentoring, your professional service, your public and civic engagement is really important to explaining how you make a larger impact. If we're thinking about this idea about the public value, the larger, broader impact of the research that you're doing, why it matters, those big questions that we started things off with. And this is where I want to introduce and explain a little bit more about this idea of public purposes, because this is the concept, this is the terminology that Mary Price uses in scholarly identity mapping, and I think it's a useful way to think about it here. And these are both important purposes, but we're going to be talking about the public ones here. So there may be personal reasons for the things that you're doing here. It might just be something about your intellectual curiosity, or you need to make a certain amount of money, or family reasons, or things like that. Like, I'm not downplaying those at all, but those are not public purposes here. This is thinking about how your work as a scholar addresses things going on in larger society here. And I've just given some examples of things about what might be a public purpose. Again, these are just examples that I came up with. They're not meant to suggest that these are the ones that you should be doing here. But if you're trying to think about what are public purposes that might be related to research, well, maybe it has to do with something like larger problems in the world, like climate change, or, particular health conditions that you want to help develop treatments for, or interventions to help prevent. Maybe you're concerned about the state of the world and the institutions and politics and democracy. How do we make those things stronger and more effective? Maybe you're worried about ecology, or you're thinking about transformative technology like AI, and how to make sure that it's being used in ways that are responsible and ethical and things like that. Those are all examples of public purposes. That doesn't necessarily mean that your every research project is about these sort of things here, or that that's the explicit purpose behind every paper that you end up writing there. But the work that you're doing may be part of a larger effort to be thinking about these sort of things here. So that's what I mean by identifying public purposes. And so what are those? Here are a couple questions to try to get you thinking about the public purposes there. Just as a fill in the blank question, or as a list that you might be able to produce, what are those public purposes of your scholarly work, of your research interests here? And then think about this in connection to the values you identified earlier before. Can you connect a particular value with it? If you said that that accuracy is particularly important to what you do with your scholarship there, Are there things around information integrity or the reproducibility of your science or, you know, sharing data, things that might demonstrate this commitment to accuracy and to transparency with the way that you're producing things there. So think about the values that connect with these things as well. Another way to think about this is to try to name the specific ways in which your work relates to these larger public ends here as well. So think about what those sort of things are, the public purposes, the larger impact that your work might be able to have, how this relates to some of the values that you've identified a little bit earlier here. I'll give you a minute or two to think about this. All right. Hopefully you had a few ideas in mind. As I mentioned before, this is going to vary a lot by the field that you're in, the discipline, the type of work that you're doing. In some cases, again, you may not, this may be just part of what you're always doing. That might not be the case, and that's fine as well. My goal is not that you all have an instantaneous answer to these that you are 100% confident in. I just want to make sure that you have thought about this before there's a situation where you might really need to make that kind of clear case. This is not the first time. So the first time you encounter something like this is not when you're sitting down to write a particular document, and you feel like you haven't really had a chance to prepare for that as well. So as is the case with the other question I posed here, if you don't feel like you have a great answer for that, perfect. That's fine. Now you just have something to think about a little bit about. And so you can try to be reflecting on that as you go about your day and as you work on some of these sort of things here. But let's tie all of this together. If you're able to, ideally, again, whether you're able to do this right now tonight in just the hour that we've had here, or whether this is something you return to when you've got a little bit more time later on here. This is the idea of creating a mission statement or a statement of purpose, which is putting together all these different pieces into a short statement that encapsulates the relationship between your values, your professional activities, and your larger engagement in public life here. And so this is an example from another resource that I think is a valuable one. Hannah Albert Abrams' Finding Your Purpose, a Higher Calling Workbook for Justice-Oriented Scholars in an Unjust World. Whether or not that language of justice is something that you see as being central to your work and your scholarship, I think this is a really useful idea. And certainly if that does resonate with you, I would recommend this resource here as well. It's a freely available e-resource that I'll have a link for when I share this out as well, which has a number of different exercises that you might find interesting here. And Hannah Alpert Abrams gives this particular example in this work here when she writes, in my scholarship, I aim to use technology to build community, increase transparency, fight inequity, create a better future for the humanities. I seek to maintain boundaries around my job that allow me to prioritize my relationship, the land I occupy, and the people I love. So this may or may not have any relationship to how you would write this sort of statement here, and I'm just using this as an example. I'm not suggesting that yours should be the same or that these should be your values here. But hopefully you can see what these sort of things are relating to. You can get some sort of sense about how, in this example, this person approaches their scholarship in terms of using technology and using it for the purpose of trying to create a better future for the humanities, so somebody in the humanities discipline here. And some of the specific values that are related to it, community, transparency, equality, some of those values that or things that related to some of the options that you may have thought about. And some of you may have resonated with some of those values here as well. There's also some personal content here around appropriate boundaries around work and life and thinking about larger place within the world and ecology here. Again, that may or may not be something you would want to include for something like that here. The point is that it helps hopefully to name how those values relate to each other, and that you can then point to examples to this. So presumably, if this was your statement there, you would then be able to give specific examples of using technology to build community and increasing transparency. Again, the point is that you have these values that you can then use to point to actions there and saying, as an equity motivated scholar, I have done these particular things to increase access and accessibility in my lab group or in my discipline. As somebody who is really motivated by entrepreneurship, these are the ways that I have sought out opportunities to do innovative things with my research, partnering with private industry, for example, or creating patentable IP that's then been used in different applications. So regardless of the values that you identify with here, the idea is to be able to put this together in a way that gives you a sentence or two that ties those points together, and that will then allow you to be able to bring in those pieces of supporting evidence, those concrete skills, accomplishments, and things that really substantiate that and show that, yes, these are clearly values that are evident in the kind of activities that you're doing as a professional here. So as we wrap things up here, I want to take stock of what it is we've been looking at here. So we've done a number of short answers. We reflected on some questions around research and around our personal journey, identified some adjectives related to particular values and descriptions of being an academic professional, thought a little bit about the relationship between the different domains of professional activity, named some public purposes, and thought a little bit about how we might put that together in a short mission statement or statement of purpose here as well. And if you're looking for a next step, I think one useful thing that you can do is to build on these a little bit more and write a couple paragraphs. Thinking about how your research contributes to your discipline in the broader world, on the one hand, and another one about your scholarly identity, about the values that motivate you and the experiences, accomplishments, decisions that really demonstrate and substantiate it there. And this is just something that hopefully you will be able to then draw upon. Again, the answers that you might have to the questions on the document that I shared with you, as well as any additional reflection you might do here, that you can use as raw material that can then be adapted to a variety of different contexts there. So if you have a paragraph or two, if you have some language, if you've got a couple sentences there, then you already have a starting point that you can use to adapt for whatever the situation is there. So these are building blocks. This is some clarification. This is you reflecting on how you see things in a way that makes sense to you, because if it doesn't make sense to you, you're going to have a really hard time trying to have someone else make sense of it as well. And so that first key step for that research communication, for contributing or rather communicating the significance of your work and what makes you distinct, is for you to have a sense of what that is. And then once you've done that, you can then begin to respond in different ways as the opportunity might present itself here. So I just want to flag again the resources that I've drawn upon in putting together tonight's presentation. Like I said, I'll be sending you a copy of these slides. There are embedded links to all of this as well. I would recommend any of these sources if you're interested in doing this in more detail. Again, some of these have some additional resources and exercises if you find this type of reflection to be helpful. And so I would be more than happy for you to take advantage of those sort of things there as well, because I think these are really good tools and that this kind of reflection can be really important. And we don't always get the time built into just the coursework and the research work that we may be doing in our programs and things to do this kind of reflection. This kind of reflection can be really important both professionally and just for your own sense of making sure that you feel like what you're doing aligns with what's important to you, and that you know what your values are and you know how they relate to the sort of things that you're doing here as well. And if you're interested in talking about this more, I'm happy to talk with anybody about the particular content of this or some of these related themes about scholarly identity, research communication, coherent public profile. You can get in touch with me at my email address, or you can schedule a time to meet with me at calendly.com/grad-fellowships. Always happy to talk about these issues around graduate student professional development, whether it's directly related to a fellowship proposal or not. So please feel free if this is something that you would be interested in continuing the conversation with. I'm definitely interested as well. I'll send you a link tomorrow to provide some session feedback if you're not able to scan this QR code. But we always appreciate getting a little bit of a sense of what you found effective or interesting, or what you would like to see different, so that we can make sure that we're providing materials and sessions that are of value to you. So thanks so much for joining here. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and stop the recording, and I'm happy to answer questions or comments or things for any of you about what we've covered here.